So, as I shared, my name is Amy Barkley. I'm a livestock and beginning farm specialist, and I work in the Southwest region of New York State. I cover 5 counties, Erie, Chautauqua, Cattaraugus, Allegheny, and Steuben. And I also work on statewide projects like this one where we're working with producers all across the state. Um, so this is our project. We are really, really excited about this. This has been a long time coming. It was ideated back in 2021. We got the grant and started in 2022, and we just wrapped up data collection and analysis about middle of this year. And so this is the culmination of all of that information. None of this work could have been done without the financial support of Northeast SARE. It is the Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education Grant Award. And this is a research and education grant program. So much of the information that we have shared with producers has been through one-on-one contacts, which is how we got the data collected and how we kind of structured this project. So I'll talk a little bit more about that, but Sarah was really integral in allowing us to have the funding to go out and do this kind of work. In addition to SARE, we have to give a huge thank you to every single producer that participated in this project. There were 38 producers across the state who made this all possible. They invited us educators onto their farms, allowed us to pick apart their production and financial data, give them suggestions for the next year, and then they went ahead and implemented some of those things in order to become more profitable and more sustainable in their poultry operations. The CCE educators that helped us, and there were a good number, are listed here. We've got Lynn Bliven, Nancy Glazier, Rachel Moody, Michelle Proscia, Michelle Podolak, Haley Fusner, Liz Alexander, and Justin Tucker. All of these folks went out into the fields, corresponded with their farmers, and gave us back information. So thank you all for all of your help with this. So for tonight's agenda, we are, oopsie poopsie, we are going to talk about a few different things here. So we're going to do the project overview, and then we're going to get into the factors influencing the efficient production of broilers. So most of my work on this project was coordination and also collecting those production factors. Then we're going to give some state averages for production and processing for both Cornish cross type birds and slow growth type birds, and then talk about a couple of the things in those categories that impact profitability. When we transition over the break, we're going to then talk more deeply about profitability, so the actual numbers of raising these animals, the expense categories, state averages that we've been able to put together for profitability, and suggestions to improve those based on the numbers that we've seen. As we get started, this is an educational webinar, and the way that I like to pose this is, as you're listening to us, make sure that you have a question or two in mind. Make sure that I answer it, and if I don't answer it, go ahead and pop it in the chat or raise your hand, and I'll be able to get that answered directly for you. Okay, so this project. This came to light in 2021 when I was about 2 years into my position here at Cornell Cooperative Extension, and I was going around to farms, and farmers were asking me the question of, how do I price my poultry? And they didn't really understand much about their costs of production. And I was like, oh, okay, so I think the numbers that are being charged for chicken meat are kind of low. We confirmed this through Meat Suite, which is a Cornell sponsored resource for folks to list whole meat products. The price of chickens average per pound at that time was something like $3.50. So you would say today, holy moly, that's really low. And holy moly, that was really low. We've seen a lot of changes since then. We've seen huge price increases. We've seen limitation of broiler availability. We've seen feed increases. It's just been kind of all over the place. So we have hoped to capture some of those numbers in our data just to show that $3.50, if that doesn't meet your cost of production, that might not be what you're charging, but we really didn't have a good grasp on what those costs of production were. This project helped answer that. We also, going around, I was looking at different broiler flocks, and I started thinking, my history is in the commercial poultry industry, including the commercial meat bird industry. And I thought, good golly, I'm wondering if these birds, these Cornish cross birds that have been created for a highly specialized, environmentally managed system, like an indoor system, how they're actually performing on grass. Because There's no production data out there on that. Yes, there is some production data from folks like Soskovich, from folks like Salatin, but those are for birds that are raised in high production scenarios. There are things involved in those scenarios like economies of scale and just general keeping opportunities that are different from these small farms around New York State that are raising birds under the 1,000 bird exemption. So, like for instance, our average flock number in New York State's about 100 birds. It's not very large versus these multiple thousands of birds that these larger producers are producing. So we're hoping that with this project, and we did achieve this, we can gather some of that information and share it out. We are going to create a white paper, so essentially a document that outlines everything that we've seen, so that folks going forward can say, well, I've got Soskovich, I've got Salatin, I've got some other folks, and I've got this report from the Northeast that says this is how broilers are performing in the Northeast region of the United States. So very happy about that. Our project distribution had 38 total farms, participating in 2 cohorts. So essentially what we did is we broke our 38 farmers up into 2 groups. So the first one started in 2022, that was their year 1. Their year 2 check-in was 2023. And then in 2023, our second cohort started their first data collection, and then they had their second data collection in 2024. So 2 cohorts of farmers doing year 1, we offer changes, and then they implement those in year 2. From those, we had 123 flocks worth of data. 97 of those flocks were Cornish cross type birds, and 26 of those were slow growth birds. Now, the slow growth birds were all different varieties all over the board. And I will talk about that when we get to hatcheries, but there wasn't a lot of consistency in the slow growth broilers. But I think that's just kind of the nature of the beast, and we're doing the best that we can to come up with averages for all of the different kinds of slow growth birds all kind of lumped together. But the Cornish cross are generally pretty consistent genetically, so I'm very confident that the numbers that we have come up with are truly the averages for those animals. So the farmers who were on this project went ahead and raised their chickens as they would normally. We collected data, or had them collect data, on general characteristics of the flock, like flock of origin, feed type, supplements that they used like apple cider vinegar or grit, or maybe vaccines they used, time in the brooder, when they went out on pasture, all of these kinds of things. In addition to those general characteristics, we also had them collect data on feed consumption. So how many bags of feed were the farmers opening for these flocks? And then we also had them mark every time a bird died and what day those birds died on, so that we could get an understanding of how the death loss happens, to understand trends and what's causing that death loss, and to better understand how much it's affecting profitability. Birds that die later in the cycle are going to have a bigger hit to your profitability than birds that die earlier in the flock cycle. We also had feed and live bird weights collected, and lastly, processing data. So farmers who either processed on farm or sent their birds out both had that data come back for the birds that we tracked all the way through the project. Each farm had 10 birds that they followed throughout the course of the project, all the way from chick through processing. So that's how we were able to get consistent numbers across these flocks. For the further breakdown, in year 1, we had 50 Cornish cross and 15 slow growth, and then in year 2, we had very similar numbers. We did notice a really large transition away from slow growth birds prior to the start of the study. So the way that the grant cycles work, we applied for this grant a year before we started the project, and the farmers that indicated interest that were growing slow growth broilers, there were many who transitioned away and into Cornish cross just from an efficiency standpoint. That was a time when feed costs were going through the roof. And so farmers really had to make a decision. Do I want to feed a slower growing, smaller bodied bird, or do I want to feed a faster growing, more efficient bird? And we saw that transition over to Cornish cross before the project started. But I still think we do have enough of the slow growth to make good comparisons across. Total birds on the project, we had about 9,000 Cornish cross and about 3,000 slow growth. Average flock size, as I shared, was about 100 birds for both slow growth and Cornish cross. Smallest flocks that we had were about 25. The largest flock that we had, I think, was 350. So this is median numbers. This is not mean numbers. So those really large and really small flocks did not skew the average number here. When we look at hatcheries, hatchery origin was kind of all over the place. And when we looked at the slow growth birds, we saw that most of those birds originated from Freedom Ranger hatchery. And when we looked at Cornish cross, we saw that most originated from Moyer hatchery. And the reason for this was in part because of word of mouth. When we think of slow growth birds, we automatically think Freedom Ranger. And Freedom Ranger is a breed, and it's also a hatchery that carries that breed. And they carry a variety of other slow growth bird types too. So some folks just went ahead with brand name recognition, I think, and went along with Freedom Ranger. But as you can see, there are many other hatcheries that also carry these, and these lists are not all inclusive of all the hatcheries that carry all of these different breeds. This is just a smattering based on what our producers used for this project. When we look over at the Cornish crosses, we see Moyer hatchery was used quite frequently, and that in part is because in Western New York, we have a person who would get in tens of thousands of chicks a year and distribute them out to producers across the area to reduce shipping stress, and to directly connect them with him. He was a processor, he is a processor. So it allowed folks to schedule their processing dates ahead of time to help with the bottleneck that sometimes happens when birds are ready to go and you don't have a processing slot for them. And those were ordered from Moyer. So that's why the Moyer is a little bit skewed in this data set here. When we looked at the vaccination programs across the different flocks, it was really interesting. Most birds were vaccinated for either Marek's or coccidiosis, and some were also vaccinated for things like infectious bursal disease. And what I can say about vaccinations is generally Marek's and coccidia not probably, they are the two most common diseases that we see in small flocks in New York State. Um, the thing is usually folks only vaccinate when they might have a problem on their farm. So just say you have a laying flock on your farm that you know has Marek's disease, you're going to go ahead and vaccinate every single day old chick that comes onto that farm to ensure that they don't pick it up because Marek's can cause issues in birds as as young as 6 weeks old. So because we raise our broilers typically to 8 or more, Marek's disease can be helpful in those situations. I was surprised that Marek's was higher than coccidiosis, just because coccidia is found in the soil, and I feel like it has a larger impact on broilers, just because our pasture-raised broilers have contact with the soil. So it was just a really interesting distribution. And I think part of that is because when you check out at these online hatcheries, they say, vaccinate your birds, question mark, and you say yes, and you check the box. Or for some hatcheries, they come vaccinated in the shell for Marek's. So like at day 18, the hatchery will vaccinate in the shell and then go ahead and sell those birds out. And if that's the case, you have to opt out of vaccination. So I'm thinking that's why Marek's was higher for our flocks versus coccidia. Um, and things like Rispens are usually a Marek's disease type thing. We saw a couple of Rispens vaccines, but then the infectious bursal disease, I think, was one of those things where the hatchery in question offered infectious bursal disease as a standard, and the producer clicked, yep, check mark, and got them vaccinated for it, even if they may have not had problems on their property previously, or maybe they did have problems on their property previously, and they vaccinated as a precaution. It's hard to say. When we think about the flocks and their use of supplements in the feed and water, apple cider vinegar is cheap and easy to get a hold of, and most producers used it just as a general rule. So apple cider vinegar is a gut acidifier added at a rate of 1 to 2 tablespoons per gallon. It can help with the immune function of the gut, and it can increase digestibility of feedstuffs, leading to some better weight gains and overall rates of gain. So apple cider vinegar is a good thing. It doesn't always help. It doesn't hurt at that low rate. Vitamins, minerals, and electrolyte supplements were also used, albeit less frequently. They're a little more expensive to purchase. They're a little harder to get a hold of. You typically have to get them from a farm supply store rather than your local grocery store. And vitamins, minerals, and electrolyte supplements have actually been scientifically proven to decrease stress responses in poultry during stressful events. So in laying hens, for instance, which is where a lot of this research originates, you give laying hens this, we call it a VTM supplement. So we give them that supplement a week prior to moving them from their pullet house, so their young grow out house, into the laying house. And then we give it a week after, and it helps mitigate the stress and helps them come in to lay at a specific, on time, essentially. And with broilers, we can use the same tactic around stressful periods, like moving out of the brooder and onto pasture, or maybe to mitigate some of the shipping stress that those birds may have experienced. Or maybe if we know that there's a really hot time or a really cold time coming up, we can go ahead and provide that as a little bit of additional insurance to help the bird maintain a little bit more of their immunity. Again, this isn't bulletproof, but it is something that will probably help and likely won't hurt. We did find that there were too much variation in our data to quantify the success of these supplements, so I couldn't pull out information and say, well, producers that fed vitamins and trace minerals had a higher rate of gain than those who didn't. There's just too many variables here. So I did pull out some data that I've analyzed the medians and means on that I'll show you in a little bit, but this is one of those things that I couldn't really break apart. I bring up death loss. Death loss is one of those things that we were very intentionally recording. And one of the reasons why we did this is because it's it can be really impactful. The way that I've organized this chart, essentially, so I'm gonna put on my pointer here so you can see it a little bit better. So I've got Cornish cross year 1 versus year 2 on the top 2 lines, and on the bottom 2 lines are my slow growth year 1 and year 2. We found that the total average mortality ranged anywhere from about 10 to 20% per flock. And if you went to take the median instead to say, okay, let's get rid of some of those 100% death loss outliers and some of those 0% death loss outliers, we came to a median mortality of about 10% per flock. Commercially, this number should be no more than 5%. If it's more than 5%, you should be panicking. But for pasture-raised birds, what I've kind of picked up is 10% is acceptable. It's not ideal, but it's acceptable. And so when we were analyzing our numbers, that you'll see coming up, we had to make decisions on which flocks to analyze, because if you had a mortality rate of just say 25%, that data is going to be very, very skewed in terms of feed conversion and just general weight gain and things because of differences in how those birds grow because of lower stocking density because their pen mates died. So the median mortality was 10%. We targeted that as our level to analyze most of the data going forward at. Here's something that I want to show you that's really interesting. For Cornish cross birds, our highest mortality was between 75 and 100% of the flock. And for slow growth birds, it was between 25 and 50% of the flock, essentially. So Cornish cross tended to die a little bit more, but those really high mortality rates were because of predation. They were not because of leg issues or even cardiorespiratory issues or brooder stress. It was simply an animal got into the pen and killed a whole bunch of animals. So we had chicks as young as 3 days old that got totally wiped out. We got animals in that, in one situation, a producer had their coops blow over in the wind. They were tarped coops, they blew off in the wind, and foxes came in and decimated everything. So huge, huge amount of variability there, in part because of the mortality loss. When we look at industry standard mortality, so 5% mortality, the flocks above that were, if you look at these, almost every single, I would say 2/3 to 3/4 of all the flocks that we evaluated had over the industry standard mortality rate. When we looked at that 10% number, it was basically 50% of our flocks that we could actually use the data from and evaluate because they had that mortality rate that was within range. For flocks that were above 25%, goodness gracious, anywhere from 0 in the really lucky year two slow growth broilers, all the way up to 23% in our year one slow growth broilers. So a lot of mortality, very high mortality. And if you look at the mortality chart, it's heartbreaking because you put so much work into raising these birds, just to lose them is really hard. The
I'm
primary
gonna
causes of,
pause
oh,
you for a second.
yes,
Just, we had a question going back to the cider vinegar.
sure.
Just says, are there studies that prove efficacy on apple cider vinegar?
Yes, tons of them. Tons and tons and tons. And I will cite some of those when we write the white paper. I've already pulled some of that information, but if you go on like Google Scholar and you look up apple cider vinegar broilers, you can pull that information and you'll see um, those studies come up.
Thank you.
Yeah, good question. All right. So, thinking about our primary causes of mortality, as I shared, predation was a really high and really devastating mortality loss rate for many producers. But what was actually the most impactful for the most producers was brooder and shipping stress. So, birds are typically shipped in from various hatcheries across the country, and depending on the time of year they're shipped, the conditions in which they're shipped, they can experience death loss within that first week. And normally we see a probably 5% death loss in that first week just from the stress of transporting those birds. Um, Brooder mortality, unfortunately, was because of poor brooder management in many cases. So we had situations where birds were, we had a really wet spring one of the years, and it caused the birds to have to stay in the brooder longer because normally producers will raise them out to about 3 weeks and then put them out onto pasture. And then you have a limited space in your brooder for those chicks because you think to yourself, yeah, right, 3 weeks. I'm going to keep them in there for that time, and then I'm going to go ahead and put them out on pasture. But what happened in this really wet, cold, awful, snowy spring is that producers had to keep them inside longer because if they put them outside, it would have been a death wish. So instead, they left them inside. The brooders got really, really crowded. They got really full of moisture and a lot of packed down feces. And unfortunately, we did have issues with cardiorespiratory failure from that. And we had issues with some stunting because of that. Other things that I've noticed just going around are brooder lamps aren't necessarily placed where the birds uh, need them. So sometimes you have a stock tank, right? And you've got, what, 2.5 foot of sides, and then you have a brooder lamp that's sitting on top of wire on top of that, shining down on the chicks. If all the chicks are huddling under that lamp really, really close together, they're probably cold. And we did see some chicks that succumbed to weakness in part because of chilling, in part because the heat lamps were not put close enough to the birds. So those are just a couple examples of different things that I've seen with brooders that could be improved to improve viability of the flocks in general. I would say if you're building a brooder and you don't yet have one and you're building one, build it like twice as big as you think you need. Because if you're raising broilers in that early season where it could be rainy, snowy, awfully windy, you want to have the capacity to keep those birds inside should you need to. Just because the conditions that can result in the overcrowding are avoidable. Okay. So, talking about feeding schemes of these flocks, we had a pretty good split between folks feeding a single protein percentage all the way through and two different protein percentages all the way through. Now, why am I talking about protein and why am I going to focus on this for like the next 5 minutes? Protein is probably one of the most important things in that feed in regards to how those birds are going to grow. Generally, there are, yes, Rachel.
Sorry, I just wanted to
That's
get
okay.
this in here before you go into protein.
Yes.
Would vitamins help reduce the mortality after transport, like vitamins in the water as soon as they arrive?
Yeah, I need to pull literature on that, but in terms of talking to producers, in terms of my own experience, um, it it can only help, it can't hurt. So generally providing vitamins and electrolytes for like the first few days after transport can help get things going. And sometimes you want to put like a little bit of sugar in the water too to just give them that little bit of pep before they start. But yeah, it can be helpful. Good question. Okay. So feeding schemes. We found that the protein in these flocks averaged between 16 and 28%, which is crazy, crazy big spread. The average was about 20, which is more in line with what I was expecting. I wasn't expecting such a range. What we found is that the protein, though, when looking through the different flocks, is not ideally matched to flock age. So there's a cost savings potential available and the ability to capture more growth in less time. And let's talk about that with this chart. This chart is from Commercial Feeding of Broilers, Commercial Poultry Nutrition, third edition, published in 2005. It is still accurate today for the Cornish type birds. When we think about Cornish type birds, we are thinking about this top box here with the crude protein. So 0 to 18 days, they should be fed a protein level of about 22%. When they transition over into that like 3 weeks of age to 4 weeks of age to 4.5 weeks of age, we're going to drop them down to 20%. Then we're going to drop them down to 18%. And, by the time that they're 6 weeks old, they can be transitioned on to a 16% protein. But the reality is, most of us don't have access to these different protein contents. So, what's the best way to do this to capture the most and give the biggest bang for your buck? Well, that would be to go ahead and feed something somewhere in the middle. So, probably a 20-ish percent, 21% protein is probably going to meet the most of your needs of those birds if you only have access to one protein source. If you overfeed protein, the bird isn't going to grow any faster. It's just going to poop it out the back end. So you're essentially paying for more protein that you're not using. Is it captured by forage? Sure. But do you want to fertilize the forage with a feed ingredient? Probably not. We did see some producers feeding down around the 16, 17% all the way through production, and they were challenged with growth rates. That's just because it's simply not enough protein for those birds to really develop in those first 4 weeks to go ahead and meet their genetic potential. So I think there's opportunities for improvement there. Some other things that I just want to touch on really quick. We did have a good number of producers that were feeding either a non-GMO or organic feed. The tricky bit with organic feeds is that they do not have supplemental amino acids in them. Amino acids being the building blocks of protein, and increasing those specifically helps increase the concentration of high quality protein in the diet. So what I would recommend is if you're feeding an organic or non-GMO feed, which is probably an organic feed for all intents and purposes, you'll want to target a couple points higher in protein just to make sure that the protein that's in the feed gets to the birds, because organic production cannot use synthetic amino acids. So you don't have that high quality protein bump that you normally would have with many conventional feeds. So just a little bit there. The other thing to note is that there is high variability in feeds and feed brands. So choose a feed brand that performs well for you. If you find that maybe performance isn't where you want, switch brands, see how they do. I saw some things pop up, Rachel. I didn't know if you wanted to cover those or not.
Well, there was a question about the recording of the webinar, if the webinar will be shared.
Oh, yes. Yep. So we're recording it, and once we get the recording cleaned up, we're going to go ahead and share it sometime next week.
Okay.
Okay, so any questions on any of this stuff before I move on to performance numbers, where we actually dig into the data? This is more like survey information. So I just want to take that moment.
This looks like a comment, not a question. Organic growers can use synthetic methionine, but are limited in how much.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Sorry, I did misspeak. That's a very good point. Yes. So if your diet doesn't use the synthetic methionine, that's where you have to go ahead and bump your protein. If it does use synthetic methionine, it's likely that that diet is of a higher quality protein. All right. So moving on to broiler performance. So the way that I've organized this is essentially Cornish cross and then slow growth broilers, year one versus year two. So you'll compare by going across the call or the rows this way. Um, our goal was to improve performance from year one to year two. We did not really see that in our Cornish crosses. So what we did see is that the average age was about the same at processing. Average feed consumption per bird was a little bit higher in year two, and that the average live weight was a little bit lower in year two for whatever reason. I think part of that could be biases from weather conditions in year two for our first cohort, and it could be other factors too. We still need to tease some of those apart. But in general, we found that year two birds had a worse feed conversion ratio. And we use feed conversion ratios to really set apart the differences between groups without getting too bogged down. So, what essentially it means is how many pounds of feed are you feeding a bird to achieve 1 pound of live weight gain? Um, and so in this case, what we found in year one, we found 1.95 pounds of feed per pound of live bird gain. Awesome. That's almost industry standard. I'm very happy with that. When it comes to year two, even though the birds were about the same age, we saw an increase in feed needed to get each pound of gain by about 0.3 pounds. So you were feeding each bird an additional 0.3 pounds per pound of live gain. So if you've got a 5 pound bird, that's 1.5 extra pounds of feed that you're feeding that bird to get it up to in this case, a smaller weight than you would have the previous year. And this is just all of the birds that are in that table that or it's the birds that are in that table plus some of the ones that were outliers that I eliminated to make that data that you just saw, all outlined here. So these are the different feed conversions, pounds of feed per pound of gain across the board. And we do see that efficiency difference here between the two flocks just with the way the data is outlined.
Amy, there's just a question about if you had any data on the hatch dates.
I do, yes. So we recorded all of the information regarding hatch dates. And so we did that in part to see if we could tease apart differences between flocks that were raised earlier in the season and how they performed versus flocks that were raised later in the season and how they performed. We ran that analysis and we didn't see a difference, surprisingly. I do think, though, that there were some differences for different producers. So producers that had a really that are challenged with spring management do better when they raise broiler flocks in the fall. And those folks that have fewer challenges can raise birds essentially all year round. So yeah, we didn't find anything significant from that. I didn't know if there's something else that you were looking for from that specific data, let me know. But that's the main thing that we used it to look at. So these are our slow growth guys. So these birds were taken out longer, and they achieved similar body weights. So, around that 6 pounds mark. But they did take 2-ish weeks longer to gain that weight. The average feed per bird, was a little bit higher, and we did see that the feed conversion for these guys is a little bit higher than it is for the Cornish cross, which is not unexpected. These birds are not putting on as much muscle as a Cornish cross, so we don't anticipate at the rate that a Cornish cross does. So we don't anticipate that they be more or as efficient as a Cornish cross. That said, slow growth broilers are highly variable in their genetic makeup. Some of them you can process at 10 weeks and they're gorgeous. Some of and like 5 pound carcasses. Some of them you can process at 12 weeks and you get 3 pound carcasses. It is just kind of all over the board because the genetics are all over the board. So I would say to get more definitive data on each breed would be lovely. And we just don't have that yet. And I think that some of the breeders may be publishing more and more of that going forward. And I'm keeping an eye out for that because if you're comparing some of these different slow growth breeds, you're going to want to choose one that best meets your system and best meets the preferences by your market. This is that same chart I showed you with the conventional. This is the slow growth, just the distribution of weights and days and feed conversions. We didn't have too many huge outliers here. And generally, we found that efficiency was very similar from year one to year two. So I'm going to just talk about some general trends. So when you're going to buy chicks, you have the option of as hatched, straight run females and males. Um, and there are different performance metrics for each of those, which is slightly reflected in the price that you pay for them. But I'm going to talk about as hatched. So males and females mixed. That was the majority of what flocks were on our project. And what I want to show you is how efficiency slows down as they get older. So if we look, and I'm missing my numbers on the left-hand side, which tell you like the efficiency difference. So I'm really sorry about that. But if you calculate the difference between the weight per week, so 49, this is 7 weeks, 56 is 8 weeks, 63 is 9 weeks. This is for Cornish cross type birds. This is from a production guide for one of the specific strains of Cornish cross. And essentially what you'll see is that there is a larger weight gain from 7 to 8 weeks versus 8 to 9 weeks. And what we also see is that cumulative feed conversion, which is pounds of feed per pound of gain, increases as those birds age. That is the tell, right? So that is this, so it takes 1.76 pounds of feed per pound of gain for those birds that are at 7 weeks of age. But if you're taking them out to 9 weeks of age down here, you can see that it increases by essentially zero point 0.3 pounds of feed per pound of gain. And as those birds hit sexual maturity, you're going to end up with fewer and fewer and fewer gains until they hit maturity, and then they lose weight because they're so active doing the bird things. So what I'm saying here is that when you're raising out your flock, figure out where you want to target your weight gains and just understand that the longer that you keep the birds, the slower it's going to be to achieve that higher weight. This is the argument that males are more efficient than females. So straight run, males and females combined. This is those same charts, but for the different sexes. So with females, we see the same trend, right? They get less efficient from week 7, up here 1.8, to week 8. Same thing with the males. They get a little less efficient. But what we can say overall is that females take more feed per pound of gain than males. Males are generally more efficient. Cool. The other thing about males is that they typically are about 1 pound heavier than females at processing. So if you're raising birds out to 8 weeks and your average, just say your male weight's 8 pounds, your female weight's going to be about 7. So males mature quicker, they put on weight faster, and they put weight on more efficiently, which is one of the reasons why males are a little bit more expensive when you buy them. So I would say take a moment, step back, and analyze the cost of male chicks versus female chicks versus straight run, and choose which ones will meet the needs of your production system best. I threw this in here. So as part of this project, one of the things we did is we got all the farmers who participated in a room together and we talked about some of the things that went well, some of the things that didn't go well, areas for improvement. And this one jumped out at me. I found this really, really interesting. We had some farmers on the study that were feeding a very restrictive diet when it came to the nutritionally complete feed. So instead of feeding ad libitum, so as the birds eat as much as they want of a feed, they were restricting them. And so the 12 on, 12 off isn't necessarily a restriction, if that makes sense, especially if you're giving them all the feed they can eat for that 12-hour period. But in this case, there were some birds that were being supplemented with veggie scraps. There were some birds that were being supplemented with meat scraps. There were some birds that were just being fed a general volume of food, and when they ate it, it was gone. And those birds I pulled out and I analyzed them versus the other birds that were full fed in their cohort. And what we found was that the birds took an average 12 days to get to weight. They weighed 1.2 pounds less than birds that were full fed. They took about a pound more feed per bird to get to processing weight, and their feed conversion was worse. So, I just found that really interesting because it comes back to this idea that birds can't make their living off of pasture alone. They really, really need to have a fully complete diet available to them in order to meet their genetic potential. And back about 10 years ago, there was a study at Penn State with laying hens. I know it's not broilers, it was with laying hens where they allowed them out into pasture and they gave them a 10% deficit in their complete feed. And they checked body weights, they checked feed conversion, they checked like yolk color, all of this different stuff. And what they found is the birds were barely able to make a living and perform as well as their full fed partners at that 10% reduction in feed. So, as you're thinking about broilers and their consumption on pasture, yes, they're consuming some things. Yes, they're consuming things that will increase the nutrition, potentially the nutrition of their meat through carotenoids and other things, but they're not able to make that protein gap, that protein need, if you do not feed them full fed in addition. So, broilers, because they have a higher rate of passage than laying hens, I would say a 10% reduction may be too high for them. Maybe a 5% reduction in full fed. They could make a living. They could get up to 100%. But you really shouldn't restrict them more than that if you want them to meet their genetic potential. Okay. So, general opportunities for improvements for efficiency. Based on what we saw over the course of these last 3 years, we have discussed these things with producers. So, the idea of taking birds out to a weight rather than an age. We take these birds out and we're like, okay, if we're growing slow growth, we want to grow them out to 12 weeks. If we want to grow Cornish cross, we're growing them out to 7 weeks. But the reality of it is that sometimes those birds, based on conditions, can end up larger or smaller depending on environment, depending on feed availability, depending on feed quality. So for some producers, it makes sense to take them out to a weight rather than an age. And for those producers who are able to process on farm, this is easier for them to manage than if you have a processing slot for a certain age at a processor. So take that with a grain of salt. Um, One of the things that we found where there were some flocks that just would not grow. Maybe they had some sort of viral or bacterial infection. Maybe it was weather and they just were not putting on weight. We did have some flocks that entered cardiorespiratory disease and death that were just some flocks just did not perform very well. And so the question that the producers were asking us was, what do we do? Do we keep them on feed or do we just say we're done? And honestly, just saying we're done is probably going to be the most efficient use of your time, labor, and feed costs. So keep that in mind as you're growing out birds. If they're just not performing, get rid of them, process them, start again. Make sure that you're charging appropriately for slow growth and Cornish cross birds. What we saw in the data before indicates that slow growth birds grow slower, they take more feed to get to weight, and you can run fewer birds through the system at a time. So you have a summer, you have 5 months to grow chickens in. If you're growing slow growth birds that take 50% longer, you're growing 50% fewer flocks of birds overall. So either you're going to have to charge more for the birds that you're growing to ensure that you would make the same amount of money versus a Cornish cross, or you increase the number of birds that you're growing per cycle in order to meet the same pounds demand that your market may have. So just something to keep in mind. We talked about stocking density already, especially in the brooder. That is so very important. But even on pasture, what we noticed, and we didn't collect information on this so that I could analyze it, but observationally, we found that birds with more area per chicken generally grew better than those in tighter, cramped conditions. Those that were moved more often on pasture generally grew better than those that were kept in one spot for a long time. We also found that the wet, cold conditions are very, very challenging for many producers to manage around. Gosh, when you're getting snow at the end of April, beginning of May, that's a problem. And for us in Western New York, when we're south of Lake Erie, and when you're up in the North Country, like it is a thing. So I talked about the very wet, cold spring in 2023 was just an issue for brooder management, and it was also an issue for cardiorespiratory failure in birds. We found that there was an elevated instance of cardiorespiratory failure coming from the cold stress that they experienced earlier in life because it was cold, wet, and then it got hot. And those birds it was like being shell shocked. They just could not, they could not meet the demands of that environment. Um, so producers generally also reported many ones that had trouble in spring, they switched to fall and they reported that they were very happy with moving to fall, that their birds performed really well. Okay. So conclusions about the production side of stuff. Broiler chickens raised with consideration will rise to their genetic potential. There are avoidable mortality issues that are leading to the death in flocks across the state, namely predation, secondarily brooder stress. I think that those are two things that we can evaluate and that we can make changes on to make our production system more efficient. Meat chickens have opportunities for improvement to reduce losses and improve the number of pounds and birds making it to the market. So I think that there are some dollars still left on the table, even after, working with many of these producers over the past 3 years. So I think that, chickens are one of those things. They're living, growing, breathing creatures. There's always something new to learn, and there's always ways to tweak your management to get a little bit more out of them. So I have processing stuff next. I just want to take a pause and see if there are any questions about production stuff. I'll give about 10 seconds to see if anybody pops anything into chat or raises their hand. Okay. Moving on to processing data. So,
Oh, we just got a question come in.
yep.
Free feed versus limited once a day versus twice? Question mark.
Yeah, I would say as long as it's daylight hours, the birds are eating it. Whether you give it twice a day or once a day. Um, Full fed is essentially just providing them food for the entire daylight period. Restricting them is when they have an empty trough for multiple hours during the daylight hours. They can't rise to their genetic potential if they're restricted like that. So to answer the question, it does not matter. 12 hours, one feeding that goes for 12 hours or two feedings, one every 6 hours. It's still full fed if they are speed left at the end of the day.
They also get a little bit more aggressive when they're hungry too.
Oh, have you ever had a
Yeah.
broiler fly at your face because they were hungry? I have.
Yeah, pecking my hands. Um,
Yes.
there is another, when it is cold, chickens eat more feed. So
Yeah.
was 1 year colder than the other in reference to feed conversion rate?
Yeah, right. So the only observational data we have is cool, wet spring. Because the flocks were distributed all over the state, pulling the climactic numbers for those flocks would be very challenging, if not impossible. But your point is very clear that yes, when the birds are shivering to keep warm, they're not growing. They're using that energy for keeping themselves warm. So yeah, that's one of the reasons why spring flocks, if you've raised broilers before, you'll notice that the spring flock birds are generally smaller sized at processing at the same age versus those birds that you raise in the summer or fall, simply because of that reason.
And then this was a follow-up question for the feed freed versus limited. They've typically fed breakfast and then dinner. Should they do breakfast and lunch instead? Would that be better?
No, I don't think so, because dinner allows them to fill their crop that is then emptying into their gizzard and the rest of their intestinal system overnight. So they're digesting and growing off that food overnight. So then they're not as grumpy in the morning when you go out to feed them their morning feed. If I had the choice, I would choose to feed in the morning and in the evening. But that is entirely up to you how you want to do it.
I think, and to Amy's point, I think the biggest thing is just making sure that they have feed in their feeder and that it's not completely empty when you go in. Um,
Right.
And then I just wanted to read this for those of you who may not see this. This is from Matt LaRue. For your information, in September 2025, the, oh boy, WTD, average price per pound for whole chicken at farmers markets in New York was $6.26, minimum
Excellent.
$5.50, maximum $8. Price reports available at meatsweet.com. Thank you,
Yes. Yeah.
weighted average. Thank you, Matt.
Highly recommend meatsweet.com, by the way, for advertising, just putting in a plug for that because it's essentially a free service that allows you to share your information about what meat products you have with folks who may not know you exist yet. So it's a cool way to expand your markets for free. And those pricing reports are really nice because they are actual numbers of actual pounds of meat sold. So it's not like going to the farmer's market and just seeing chicken breast for $15 a pound and drumsticks for $3 a pound. It's actually what is sold, and then that's put into that weighted average that Matt just shared. So awesome data. Appreciate that, Matt. All right. So moving into processing data. So these farmers collected all of the things that we just shared, and they also processed 10 birds out of each flock to give us a representative sample of what the flock was. We told them to choose an average looking birds. If they had males and females mixed, we told them to choose 5 males and 5 females. If they were all one sex, we had them choose all one sex. Um, the birds were essentially tagged 2 or 3 weeks prior to processing. So slow growth birds got 3 weigh dates. Cornish cross birds got 2 weigh dates. So Cornish were a week before processing and the week of processing for live weights and feed weighbacks. And then the slow growth birds had an extra week added on. And the reason that we did that was because we wanted to show producers what would happen if they processed those birds earlier, because we knew an approximate yield, so pounds of meat off of that live animal. And so we could help them make decisions of, okay, do you want to back up your dates and get those birds into the processor sooner? So that's why we did that. Those chickens were tied back to their live weights, so each individual bird was tagged back to their individual live weight, so we could really see what that percentage was over per bird. The farmer had the choice whether they wanted to keep those birds whole or part them out. And if they wanted to part them out, they had full reign on how they parted them out. So we saw all different cuts. I'll share that in a moment. And then farmers also had the choice of keeping feet, necks, soup bones, gizzards, livers, hearts, if they wanted to. We actually even had one producer that kept the fat pad in the back end of the bird because her birds got a little fat. So she kept that, and she was keeping it to make chicken fat potatoes or something. So we did even record that. So it was totally producer choice. What we found is that Cornish cross typically yielded about 75% of their live weight. So you take the bird and you remove the head, the feet, the feathers, the guts, you get 75%-ish of live weight. Slow growth birds were consistently lower by about, what is that, 6%, 5-6%, just because they've got some more legs to them. They've got a little bit more bone to them, and they have a little less fleshing in their breast. So because of that, the yield is decreased for the slow growth birds versus the Cornish cross. And this is the processing data. Again, it's going to be broken out the same way as the production data was before. This is year 1, year 2 on the same slide for first Cornish cross, and then I'll jump into the slow growth birds. So some summarizing data, the average processing age in year 1 was about 7.5 weeks. In year 2, 7 weeks. Live weight was about 7 pounds for both. Average processed weight was about 5 pounds for both. And then our average feed conversion per pound of carcass. So instead of taking pounds of feed per live weight, this is now pounds of feed minus all the guts and stuff. So pounds of feed per pound of carcass. So we found about the same year over year. For slow growth, those birds were taken out again a little bit older. So this is about 7.5 weeks. This is about 10.5, 11 weeks. So about 3 weeks longer for these guys. Average live weight was a little bit lower, not terribly lower, but a little bit lower for these. Processed weight was significantly smaller. So these are 4-ish pound birds versus 5-ish pound birds. So we lost about a pound there. Average processing feed conversion, this is kind of where, the money hits the fan here. 5.31 pounds of feed per pound of carcass for year 1 and about 4 pounds for year 2. The difference there was not an efficiency bump per se. I think it was a breed collection difference in our year one versus year two birds. Like I said, slow growth, take the data comparison with a grain of salt because it's going to be based a lot on the breeds that were selected. Okay, parts and pieces. For those of you who are not aware, we have options for parts and pieces, including for legs, we have either drumsticks and thighs, that was one option, or producers could leave the thigh and the drumstick together for a leg quarter. For breasts, we had boneless, skinless, boneless, skin on, and bone in, skin on. And some of the bone-in skin-on folks also did breast quarters, so they basically took that breast and just chopped it in half. So we had that option, and then for wings, you could either do full wings. The wingtips here are cut off, but if you were doing full wings, you had to include the wingtip. And then you could do wing pieces. So the drumette and the flat essentially split. All those four pieces were weighed together to get the weight of the wings with wing pieces. And then if folks were doing carcasses, we only did if it was the full cage. So the back and the breast portion of that carcass. We did not include necks, we did not include feet, we did not include anything else that might go into a stock bag just to keep things consistent. And this is what that data looks like. So there's a lot of numbers here. We'll notice that there's not a ton of flocks that did part out. Gosh, I think it might have been about 20% of the flocks or so did parting out. And so it wasn't a huge number of folks. I think I might have that number. I have that number somewhere. In any case, one of the biggest things that I want to draw your attention to is that breast meat percentage was higher in the Cornish cross. Again, not surprised. Except for when we come to bone in, skin on, we do see this difference, but there's not enough numbers here for me to make a definitive conclusion. But, here you can say pretty well, this does support that Cornish cross generally have a higher percentage of boneless, skinless breast on their carcass. And when we go down the line and we compare that to leg quarters, drumsticks, and things, we do find that the slow growth birds generally have larger drumsticks and thighs because that is just how they are built genetically. So this just kind of confirms what we already knew. And it's kind of fun to see the general percentages that come off the bird. So this is useful for when you're pricing your birds. You can say, okay, if I'm pricing Cornish cross, my breast meat's about 30%, my legs are about 30%, my wings are about 10%. So what do I have to charge for those pieces in order to, make the money that I would normally on a whole bird? So that's where these kind of charts come in handy. So the parted out takeaways. If you're only selling traditional cuts and not soup bones, you are selling between 64 and 70%, 74% of the whole carcass for a Cornish cross. The reason for that variation is wingtips, yes or no. And it is also if the breasts are bone and skin on or boneless, skinless. Bone and skin on is going to give you more weight, so you can sell more of the carcass that way. For slow growth, we're actually selling more of the whole carcass. And I sat there questioning, why is that? And I think it's just because there's more bone density going on in those birds that's causing us to have just a higher percentage of total meat. So this is so the 70% of this slow growth versus the 64 of the Cornish cross, that is boneless, skinless breast, that is leg quarters, that is wings without tips. And for slow growth birds, they just had a little bit more to them. In terms of the whole carcass, when you're cutting up those breast quarters off and all that is waste is the back, there's very little waste in the carcass. We didn't see as many breast quarters in the Cornish cross, which is why I think that number might be a little bit lower, but also I do think there's a bone density thing going on. So I'm gonna have to double check the other research data to confirm if that's the thing. But that might be what's going on. I did note that there was a bias in this data because more bone and chicken breast was sold from the slow growth birds. So I do acknowledge that. Slow growth have more leg meat. We already talked about that. And there is just more total meat on a traditional Cornish cross. Okay, this is other parts. You could call them variety meats, or you could call them offal. So things that would typically go in the trash that folks salvage out and sell because there are some markets for some of these things. Um, they're percentages of live rather than percentages of the carcass because you're essentially reclaiming more value of that bird by retaining some of these parts and pieces. If you keep all of the things that are in this chart, so the neck, feet, liver, heart, gizzard, you're keeping about 10% more of the live bird to sell if you can sell it. And the other thing to note here is that there is extra processing steps that happen with almost all of these bits and bobs. So the neck, that's pretty easy. We take that off anyway, but the feet have to be peeled. The liver has to have the gallbladder removed and some of those ligaments inside removed. The heart needs to have the valves cut off and the pericardium removed. The gizzard needs to have the inner layer of skin removed from the inside of the gizzard to be saleable and some of the extra fat removed on the outside. So then it comes the question like, does it make sense? And I'll ask this again as we go forward. Does it make sense to keep those bits and bobs? And in some cases it might. I would say if you're keeping them, charge for them because it is a specialty value added product, and you deserve every penny that you get for them. Okay. We did see a transition away, interestingly, from cut up and saving offal from year one to year two. In year one, we had so we had 12 total flocks, including the slow growth and the Cornish that did cut up. And year two, we only had 7. So it was many fewer. And I think in part that was because when we shared the data with the producers and we looked at the labor associated with cutting up bits and bobs and the reserve stock of like all of those soup bones, all of those feet, and all of those drumsticks in the freezer, I think it got some gears turning and folks were like, you know what, this makes no sense. I'm gonna just go back to charging and selling whole birds. So I think that's what some of that transition was. We saw the exact same transition with the bits and bobs, all of that variety meat data. 13 flocks were saving all of the things, and then in year two, only 7 were saving all of the things. And we found that those that were saving out these pieces were only keeping select pieces like livers and feet that were meeting very specific market channels. So just found that interesting. Okay. So general thoughts for improving processing profitability. Are you getting the most out of your carcass? Again, that question of is cutting up that bird worth the return? Are you pricing those pieces so that you're returning a profit on the investment of your time and labor, extra packaging, extra inventory management? And is keeping every part of the bird actually worth it? Does it make sense to keep the gizzards? Does it make sense to keep the feet? That is a question for you and what your market essentially is looking for and what you're charging for that market. But I just like to keep that in mind because I know that we want to save every bit of the bird. And also I recognize that it may not be profitable for everybody. Okay, so that's the end of my portion. I will welcome any questions, comments, stories, that you may have at this time. And then we'll go ahead and take a break right after this and transition to Caitlin Wally-Stoll's presentation. But any questions on production in general? I see Lee Minas. Hi, Lee. I don't know how to unmute him, Rachel.
You're asking me.
Oh, there we go. Ask to
Yeah,
unmute.
there we go. Hey, Amy.
Cool. Hey,
Can
Lee.
you hear me now?
Yes.
So I'm curious, you had mentioned earlier about pricing, adding up prices of parts versus whole birds,
Mhm.
and then valuing the labor, the additional labor to cut them up.
Yeah.
In my experience, I would say it takes about maybe an additional minute to cut those birds up. So the labor is pretty negligible.
Mhm.
And then the pricing with the participants, were you seeing pricing on the parts based on making what they could get off the whole bird, or were you looking at more strategic pricing? Because in my experience, is once you start parting up, you start getting to a better price point, and which allows you to have significant overall pricing of that chicken.
Yeah, no, those are excellent questions. So Caitlin Wally-Stoll is going to get more into that evaluation, but generally what we were finding is that folks were just pricing based on other prices at the farmers market. They were not necessarily pricing to meet a certain value of the bird. Caitlin was saying to folks as we were going through, price your breasts to get back the cost of the bird, and then all the rest is profit. And that was something that some of our producers, went forward with. But generally speaking, when we started the first evaluations, it was just kind of based on a whole bunch of different things. There wasn't really any consistency to it. As for the taking a minute to part out those birds, that's amazing. I'm so glad that you can do that. I've worked with a whole bunch of brand new to processing producers on this study, and it would take them upwards of 5 to 10 minutes to part out a bird. So, when it comes to that, and then the idea of packaging that bird, and then shrink wrapping that bird, and then labeling that bird, and weighing that bird, all those parts and pieces, it just ended up being a whole lot of time. So I think when you're really efficient at it, so some of our farms were super efficient, like in that minute category that you were talking about. But many of our farms were just not quite there. I think if you get really efficient, it's worth it. But
Well,
it could be worth it.
one of the things we found was this is also 10 years ago when we were raising chickens, but we didn't have a lot of market for the frames. And so
Mhm.
we actually gained a lot also by once they came out of the plucker, we just parted them straight out of the plucker instead of
Huh.
eviscerating. So we were trading, actually being
Oh,
quicker by not having to eviscerate because the
that's
offal
smart.
offload frames just weren't a market for us. So peel the breast, pop the leg quarters, pop the wings off, and you're done. And
Yeah.
you've saved a significant amount of time,
Yeah, it's probably equivalent to just gutting the bird at that point.
or less. So
That's amazing. Awesome. Yeah,
great,
that's a super good
great and
tip.
interesting numbers.
Yeah, thank you.
Uh, We do have another question.
Hmm.
So it says we start our birds out inside in bad weather, but at what point will coccidia cause problems?
Yeah, good question. So, coccidia usually kicks in around 3 weeks of age. And it can occur in flocks up to 12 weeks of age. That's about the time when they develop innate immunity to it. Um, this year was terrible for cocci. I was seeing cocci in birds as young as 2 weeks old. And I was seeing recurrences of coccidiosis even after treatment. So I would say start looking for bloody feces around 2 weeks of age, especially if you know that the environment's a little more crowded than you want or a little more damp than you want, and just manage it as it comes along. But if your birds get cocci, just for those who don't know, the recommendation is you need to treat the entire flock for the full course of treatment, just to make sure any other individuals that are not showing symptoms are also treated because they do have it. They're just not at a critical threshold where it's causing clinical disease. Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Is that all we've got for right now?
So far,
All right. Well, I will say, let's take a break. I love this ad. So let's take a 5 minute break. I am going to get Caitlin's presentation loaded up, and then we will reconvene here at 7:15. We're gonna start from the beginning.
Hello, and welcome to the financial side of our optimizing the economic return of pasture raised slow growth and conventional broilers. I am here to talk about poultry profits and problems, which I feel like is a pretty good theme and summary of our research project. This has been a ton of fun, and we have so much data that we have the opportunity to look at and help influence future pasture raised poultry projects in New York State and help support all of the farmers who were involved in this project and all of the farmers who are interested in the topic. My name is Caitlin Wally-Stoll, and I, as part of this project, was the lead for the financial analysis side of our research efforts. At the time, I was the farm business management specialist and team leader with the Southwest New York Dairy Livestock and Field Crops team. In March of this year, I moved into a new role with Cornell Cooperative Extension of Chautauqua County, where I am their agriculture team leader. Unfortunately, in my new role, I actually have a really big event happening at the same time as this that I am at and supporting our staff at. So I am not able to join you live, but I'm really grateful for Amy to coordinate with me to be able to show this recording. And then if you have any questions or concerns, I am hoping to hop on to be able to answer some questions live and catch the tail end of this. And if not, you can feel free to give me a call or send me an email, and I would love to help you or help navigate how this data could apply to your farm. I also wanted to, similarly to Amy, wanted to acknowledge Northeast SARE for their financial support of this project. It would not have been possible without them, and it's such important data that's going to and has already helped a lot of farms, and was, previously kind of a unexplored set of financial analysis for the pasture-raised broiler industry. So it's been really exciting to get the opportunity to work through that. So we're really grateful for Northeast SARE support. So as I was in charged with doing the financial analysis for this project, I was looking at three main efforts. So we wanted to measure costs, work with the farms who were involved on the project to identify opportunities for them to measure costs, create systems for them to measure costs, and then have the chance to analyze those costs. We can take those costs and use them to benchmark finances for that farm, for farms all across the state, and for future farmers, and then identify ways that farms could adjust for profit. So at the end of the day, we want to make sure that the farms who are working with us are profitable, and we were grateful to be able to put some financial data to that discussion to hopefully increase the profitability of pasture-raised broiler projects in the future. So it's all about money. I know I sound like it's all about money, but I promise you it's really important. And we started with the worst side of it, which is expenses. So we worked with farms to identify which expenses we needed them to track to try to get a handle on how much does it cost to pasture raise a broiler. We divided expenses into three main categories. These were direct, indirect, and non-cash. Our direct expenses were the easiest, right? These are things that you can really easily tie to broiler production. You are giving somebody cash for and you're getting a receipt in return. So these are things like the chicks that you would start broilers from, broiler grower, other feed stuff, bags for freezing poultry in, shavings, right? And everything in between. So these were things that I am buying this for my broilers with this money, give me a receipt and I'm going to go give it to my broilers. Very straightforward, direct expenses. The next category of expenses is where things start to get interesting. So these are indirect costs. We also refer to them as overhead costs. So these are costs that are either shared with other enterprises on the farm, or costs that will help support the farm's efforts for years to come. So indirect or overhead costs included things related to processing. So kill cones, scalders, pluckers, you buy them once. Hopefully you have them for several years in the future. Things related to housing, so feeders and waters, chicken tractors, brooders, and then things related to marketing. So did you have a farmer's market fee that you had to pay? Were there marketing expenses for your farm? The reason that those types of expenses are considered overhead expenses is that most often the farms that we were working with on this project, broiler production was one piece of their farm, right? So they did not represent all of that they did on their farm. They also had eggs for chicken. They were also doing maple syrup. They were also raising beef cattle. So we were charged with taking these overhead expenses and trying to apply a portion of that expense to the broiler enterprise. The broiler enterprise is just that piece of the puzzle, the piece of the pie that represents broiler production. When we did that for all of my farm finance nerds out there, we did allocation primarily for all of our overhead expenses. So what that means is if you spent $100 for a farmer's market booth and you went to that farmer's market to sell broilers or to sell chicken, to sell eggs, to sell flowers, right? We would say, okay, how much of that market did you sell for your meat birds? How much did you sell flowers at that market? And try to allocate the cost of that market stand accordingly. When things got really difficult, when it's tough to do, so let's think about liability insurance, for example. If you had a liability insurance policy that wasn't super specific to your broilers, it was just a whole farm liability insurance policy, we would allocate that cost based on the income that the farm received. So if 10% of the farm's income was from broilers, then we included 10% of the liability policy as an expense for raising those broilers. Then we got into the even trickier stuff, which would be non-cash expenses. So these are expenses that you're never actually paying for, but they cost your farm a whole awful lot. The biggest one is labor, right? So very rarely are we writing ourselves a check for all of the work that we do on the farm. So if you were to process birds on Sunday, you would not expect a check for your wages on Monday to hit your bank account. We assigned values to labor. When farms did not want to assign a value, we assigned minimum wage as a minimum value, because you could be raising chickens or you could be working at a minimum wage job. We wanted to provide value to the family labor that the farmer and their families were utilizing to raise the broilers. We also included non-cash expenses for depreciation. So when we for example, buying scalders and pluckers, we use straight line depreciation for calculating out a yearly expense for equipment that would last from year to year. We assigned a non-cash value for mileage. So instead of asking farmers to calculate how much gas they spent when they were driving around picking up chicks, or what the usage of their tires were for when they were driving to the store to pick up chicken feed, we ask them to keep track of their mileage, and then we utilize the federal mileage rate in all of our expense calculations. So a lot of expenses, it's a lot of time. We really appreciate all of the farms who did put in the time to track these expenses, because it's not easy, right? We would love to have all of the time. I would love to have all of the time to keep track of these, but nobody farms because they really love paperwork. So it is always kind of, the last thing that happens at the end of the day. And it's really difficult to keep track of all of these different expenses, particularly the overheads and non-cash expenses. So I'm really appreciative of all of the farms who took the time to do this. Now, I'm going to start with some of the numbers, because I know that everybody is super excited to hear and see and talk about some of these numbers. So let's get into it. The largest cost that we found, true cash costs that we found, was feed. Feed accounted for 22% of the cost to raise a broiler. This is pretty similar in other areas of agriculture and other production models. Feed tends to be a big expense on any farm, particularly for broilers, which are feed heavy, right? So when we talk about things like Amy talking about feed efficiency, it's important not just from a production standpoint, but it's very important from a financial standpoint, where we want to get that total feed cost as low as we can and manage it as best we can, knowing that it is the biggest expense that we likely have on our farm. On average, the income received per broiler was $21. So for every broiler, you would receive $21 in cash that you could deposit into your farm banking account, and you would spend $20. So the average cash expense per broiler was $20. So you get $1 left over. But when we added in those non-cash expenses like labor and mileage, the average total expense per broiler was $35. So it costs $35 to raise a broiler, process it, market it, sell it, start to finish. So $35 per broiler, which if you can do math, is not great. And we'll talk a little bit more about it in just a little bit. On average, the average price that folks in New York State were selling their whole birds for was $5 per pound. We'll talk a little bit about why that number can be a challenge to just randomly give out to people, but it's something that I get asked a lot. So we wanted to offer right here up front, $5 per pound was the average whole bird price. This is an example of some of the numbers that we were able to tease out of our financial data. And again, it wouldn't have been possible without the farms who were on the project. And so we're really grateful for them. And we're really grateful for and excited to see all of the things that we can do with these numbers. So there, I gave you some numbers, and now we can keep going with my farm business management side of this. So let's talk about profit. Profit is really important, and sometimes I get a little bit of pushback when I talk about profit, because most farmers aren't farming for a profit, right? We would pick any other industry or thing to do with our time, but profit is really important. Profit is typically represented by the equation income minus expenses equals profit. I challenge everybody that I work with to put profit first and think about profit first. It does not make you a bad person to think about profit first. When we look at this as profit equals income minus expenses, It's showing that we are intentionally thinking about profit first and managing our incomes and managing our expenses to earn a profit. It is okay to put profit first. It is okay to raise your prices. It is okay to manage your broilers to earn a profit. It's okay to demand a profit from your farm because that is your business. And in order to stay financially sustainable, you have to earn a profit. Profit is all of the money that's left over after your break-even price. Your break-even price is where your income equals your expenses. You are earning just as much as you are spending. That's a goal, right? Profit past your break-even point is an even better goal. Profit is where you are able to receive a return on your investment. It's incredibly difficult to manage your farm and manage your broiler enterprise for profit without understanding what your expenses are. Knowing your total expenses helps you make informed decisions and manage your farm to earn a profit. You can manage your farm for a profit. You can make decisions beforehand that will set you up for success. And the goal of this project was to tease out some of those financial indicators and be able to say, here is what makes a farm profitable. Unfortunately, we found that most of the farms on the project are not profitable. And what this has alluded to in conversations amongst our research team and continued efforts at analyzing the data is that broilers as a standalone enterprise are very, very difficult to earn a steady and sustainable profit from. On average, a farm lost $13 for every broiler that was sold. So the average profit was negative $13. This includes all three categories of expenses: your direct expenses, your overhead expenses, and the non-cash expenses. If we took out the biggest non-cash expense, which is labor, the average profit was $1.26 per broiler processed. That means that for every broiler that was processed on the farms that we worked with and gathered data from, only $1.26 was added to the bank account. Okay. And when we think about it in that way, even if we want to fight about non-cash expenses and does it matter, does it not matter, when we think about all of the work that goes into raising broilers, I think that it's a pretty unsettling number to know that only $1.26 was put into the bank per bird, based on the research data that we were able to analyze. So we're going to talk a little bit more about the theory of profit, and then we'll get into some numbers. When we were working on this project and realizing how unprofitable it could be and how disastrous it could be, it was a little bit of a challenge to work with farmers and think internally for ourselves, what do you do if you're not making a profit, right? And essentially, it boils down to three options. And it all goes back to that profit equation. You can decrease your expenses, you can increase your income, or you can get out. What does decreasing expenses look like? We found through this project that there were very high feed costs associated with raising broilers on pasture. There was very high mileage associated with raising broilers on pasture. Every time we went to the post office to pick up chicks, every time we went to the feed store to pick up feed, every time we had to drive quite a distance to a processor because that was the only option in our area, that adds up over time. We also found that there were really high indirects, really high overhead expenses, particularly for farms that didn't have other enterprises that they could spread those expenses across. So we found through this project that it's very difficult to be profitable when the only enterprise you have is broilers. When you have a broiler enterprise in conjunction with other things happening on your farm, it's a way to attract customers. It's a way to utilize equipment and utilize space that you might not have. It's a way to provide a complementary product as part of your farm offering, but it was not a very great way to have a profit. And a large reason for that were these high overhead expenses. So what do? If you're not making a profit, you decrease your expenses. So we are able to put numbers to this. When we talk about high feed costs, 22% of your cost is feed. When we talk about high mileage, when we talk about high indirects, and these are all ways that you can manage your farm for profit. The second thing that you can do is increase income. We saw this in our project with farms that were charging a low price for their meat. They had a lot of birds that they held onto for home use, which isn't a problem, but what happens is all of the expenses for that bird show up, but then the income for selling that bird for cash does not, right? And so this is another good example of why non-cash expenses are a really big deal. So if you want to make your farm profitable, you increase your income. So you raise your prices, you reduce home use or discards or losses, and try to find pathways for bringing more cash into your farm. The third option for making a profit, if you're not already, is getting out, right? So as I mentioned, broilers are just not a great standalone enterprise. It's really tough financially to earn a profit from broilers. And if that's the biggest takeaway that we got from this project, then I will accept that, because I've been guilty of working with beginning farmers and encouraging them to go the broiler route to get started, right? It's not great to start on a financial loss. And you know, it might be something that it's a great way for you to gain some skills, so that's why you do it. It might be a way for you to gain customers, but unless it's part of a long-term plan of incorporating other enterprises, it might be best to get out. You are not a failure if you stop doing something on your farm. So if you start paying attention to the finances of your farm and you notice something that's just not profitable, it's okay to say, I'm going to take a break from this for a little bit, and I'm going to do something else that will be more profitable for my business. Now, we're going to give you some more numbers, we're going to give you some more problems, and we're going to give you some more statewide averages. So some of the problems that we encountered on this project, we anticipated some of them caught us off guard, and then we had to figure out how we were going to deal with it on the data side of things. But overall, these are somewhat consistent problems that I've seen on other farm financial projects that I've worked on. So the first is variability. There's a saying that there's a million different ways to farm, right? And all of them are right. Probably all of them are a little bit wrong. But what it means is that there's a million different variable ways to farm. And when we try to find an average out of a bunch of different things, that average is an average, right? But it's also can be a little bit useless because it's an average that doesn't actually represent any real situation. On this project, we were really grateful for the farms that were working with us, but those farms range from a variety of different production models, years in business, record keeping styles, right? Goals. So some farms, you know, had different goals, and that affected what their farm financial profitability looked like. And that variability was really tough to manage on the data side of things. Some of the numbers that are included in this presentation might change over time as we continue to look through the data, but I wanted to say that not every single farm that was a part of this project was able to include their numbers, purely just because they were so variable that they didn't fit into what we were trying to establish as a representative average, right? We also had problems with shared expenses, which I have already talked about and alluded to. So when we're thinking about overhead expenses, those can be really tricky to piece out. We also had farms that, you know, were purchasing feed and purchasing shavings and purchasing other products that were shared amongst all of the poultry on their farm. So it was tough to kind of say, okay, well, how much of this bag was used for the meat birds specifically? We had issues with shared expenses. For example, when you're going to town to pick up feed, but you're also getting dinner and you're also running your errands. And how do you assign that entire cost to the farm, and just having those conversations? As I mentioned too, record keeping is not always a top priority for farmers. None of us farm because we really love keeping records. We farm for a variety of other reasons, and records are just kind of a necessary evil of the job. What that creates is a system where I am trying to work with farms to retroactively establish expenses, or some expenses get missed, or some things aren't kept how we would like to have it in a research setting, right? But it's very appropriate for a life setting, and record keeping was an issue throughout this project. I will say that it did warm my heart very much when farms, you know, when we did kind of the year-to-year look back of what are you going to change, what did you learn from this project, farms that stated that they were changing their record keeping style because they realized that there are numbers that are falling through the crack, or things that they're not accurately representing or accurately thinking about based on their checkbook balance. But once you start asking them and challenging them to keep the records on these things, it kind of makes you think for a minute. And then not lastly, but the other big problem that we had with this project is just a small sample size. While 50 farms felt like a lot, or 50 plus farms felt like a lot throughout the length of the project, at the end of the day, from a financial standpoint, that is still a really small sample size, especially when you add in these other problems of variability, farms that have different scales of shared expenses, farms that have different record keeping systems. And that small sample size did prevent us from drilling down into some of the super specific numbers that we wanted to get to. So what we had to do is take a step back and identify the numbers and the benchmarks and the financial pivots that we could feel confident talking about, and figure out a way that we could use them to compare farm to farm. One of the problems that we have when we're talking about comparing farm to farm, or trying to identify how did this farm stay profitable while this farm lost money over time, is that correlation cannot imply causation, okay? Correlation, and for those of you who know this, I apologize because I'm not going to explain it correctly, but correlation is a coincidence, right? Or maybe it's not a coincidence, but it's not as simple as saying this caused that. One really good example that I just lost now that I'm talking out loud is, so thinking about slow growth broilers, right? I came into this project thinking, okay, for sure, we're going to be able to say this is profitable versus this. And one of those was conventional versus slow growth broilers. And in my head, I was like, yep, this makes sense. This is why, this is what's going to show up. And then once the finances started coming in, it wasn't as clear cut. So what we would do in a research setting is we would go get more data, right? We'd find more farms, we'd keep going, we'd see if we get to a point where the data is starting to show a significant difference. With the way that our research project was set up and just the nature of agriculture in New York State, we're limited with the farms that we can work with in small sample sizes. So yes, we might look at this data and say, okay, clearly this caused this, or we might look at it and say, hey, did you notice that farms that were slow growth broilers had this specific thing about them? So that must be the reason that they're profitable or not profitable, right? But unfortunately, we can't say that confidently. So with some of our numbers, we had such small sample sizes, it's really tough to say, okay, the reason that this farm was profitable or this group of farms is profitable is because of X, Y, and Z. It's purely just because correlation does not equate to causation. And so it's really easy to say, oh, this is why it's this way, but it might just be a coincidence. So it's difficult. So the numbers that I'm presenting to you are numbers that, I feel confident presenting. Yes, we have additional numbers and additional data points that we collected and tried to analyze. But the reason that we aren't necessarily publishing them or saying, yes, you can confidently use this as a benchmark for your farm comes back to that small sample size. So you might have heard me say per broilers processed. And the reason that I keep saying that is because it is the main financial indicator and the main financial data unit that we used for benchmarking on this project. Some of the problems that we encountered are chicks die, right? So it would be really easy for us to say, okay, let's say these are your total expenses per chick. But when you have a predator problem or a disease problem early on in life and you have 200 chicks at the beginning of your project and you end up with 100 of them, it makes your numbers look very incorrect. Not all birds are meant for sale as well. So some of the time we're raising birds for home use at the same time as for what we're selling, and we'll talk about why that's important and why that matters. And then the other thing we found is that freezers get full. So when we were trying to collect income data, we might have farms that discounted their chicken purely just for marketing to try to unload their freezer. We had farms that carried inventory over from year to year, which made it difficult to try to analyze financially. So what we did is when we got all of the expenses and income per farm, we divided it out into these categories or these units. And these are what were provided to the farmers. So the farmers got this data for their farm. One was farm all flock. So that just looks at the whole picture of your farm. So we would be able to say, hey, on your farm, you had this much income for broilers and this much expenses for broilers, and here's what your profit was. This doesn't work when we're trying to compare farm to farm, because we have farms that were raising 1,000 broilers and we had farms that were raising 40 broilers. And in order to be able to compare the two, we needed to find a mutually acceptable data point. Per broiler sold was also a little bit of a difficult one. So what happens is we were looking at income numbers, and we could base the income off of the checkbook value, right? Or the accounting transaction that was recorded. But as many of us know, if you're raising a farm, you're also raising meat for yourself. Those expenses for those birds that you kept for yourself ended up in your checkbook, but the income for those birds did not. So what ends up happening is you look super unprofitable because you have all of these expenses and not the income to offset it. You have a freezer full and it makes you feel really good, and you got to feed your family the product and, you know, have that experience, and that's part of the reason that you're farming. But from a financial standpoint, you did not have the income to back up those expenses. So per broiler sold is a really useful tool to show you what's the value of me, you know, filling my freezer, and am I comfortable with that dollar amount? And if I'm not, what do I need to do to change it? But it's not a useful tool for comparison's sake. Per broilers process was the happy middle. So per broilers process meant that we took all of the expenses and all of the incomes occurring on a farm and divided it amongst all of the broilers that made it through processing. So what this does is it helps to offset any birds that were kept after processing and the income wasn't recorded. So these would be birds that were kept in inventory over the year, birds that were used for home use, and it also helps offset any early losses that didn't show up on expenses, right? So if you had 100 chicks or 200 chicks to start with and 100 that made it to processing, you did not feed all 200 of those chicks, right? If you had an early chick death. So it's not fair to say that the expense got divided amongst 200 when the majority of the expense was divided amongst 100. So we went to the per broilers process. It's not great, right? Like there's other ways that we could have done it, but it was the best compromise that we could do. We also tried looking at per pound sold, just purely as a communication tool to talk about what should you charge per pound. The difficulty with that was that we weren't always recording accurately how many pounds of meat was actually sold or processed as well. So what happens is, you know, you kind of have an idea of each bird weighs about this much. And for the research birds, you had that data. But we were taking expenses on a whole flock basis, not just on the research birds. So we needed to be able to break out those expenses. When we're not accurately recording off of every single sale how many pounds of chicken wings it is and how many pounds of chicken breast it is, it makes it really difficult to get down to that level. We tried for the farmers, and the data that they gave us is the data they got back. So, you know, if they knew they did a good job recording per pound sold and per pounds or pounds sold and pounds processed, and those are reliable numbers. If they knew that it was a best guess, then those numbers are best guesses. And again, we tried doing per chick started just as a financial adventure, and it was really depressing, and it really, you know, shows kind of the lost opportunity of early chick death if you wanted to apply some level of importance to it. So per broilers process really is the best option that we have when we talk about benchmarking. Benchmarking was an important piece of this project. Benchmarking is comparing yourself to others or comparing yourself to yourself from year to year or situation to situation. Benchmarking includes establishing a set of financial record reference points. So these are things that you can compare from year to year. You can set goals and identify problem areas as you go through. So by using per broilers process, that's our benchmark. And then we can pick out different areas of financial indicators that we want farms to pay attention to and then make decisions accordingly. Some benchmark numbers, just for example, include it costs $6 per broiler processed in feed. Per broiler processed, you spent $2.70 on a chick. So for example, if you were trying to decide, hey, is it worth me going after the more expensive chick or a lower expensive chick? You could say, well, the average was $2.70. Per broiler marketing cost was $2.74. per broiler processing cost was $8.76. And these are just examples of what you can do with benchmarking. So is benchmarking worth it? You bet. And I have some really good news to share. The farms who participate in this project from year 1 to year 2, 81% of them improved their farm profitability, which is, it's not easy to make changes that you see the effect of it in 1 year, but we were able to see farms that we worked with on this project make changes, whether it was on the production side of it, the financial management side of it, the expense management side of it. 81% of them increased their profitability from year 1 to year 2. They were able to make actionable change that they could see in less than a year. It doesn't mean that they were super profitable, right? It just means that they improved their profitability. So they were getting closer and closer to the goal of financial stability. There's a saying in the farm business management world, you can't manage what you can't measure. And being able to apply records, apply expenses, apply financial indicators to these big ideas of how do you navigate spending and growing and farming and record keeping, being able to measure things gives you an opportunity to manage them. And benchmarking is one of those tools that we can use to manage our farm for profitability. Some things specifically, just because I know you're wondering, oh, well, how did they do that? That the farms who were able to improve their profitability on this project included things around cost control. So reducing your feed waste, reducing the feed that you were feeding, processing a little bit earlier so you didn't have costs that were as high, setting goals for your farm. So maybe we're going to work to get them out on pasture a little bit earlier to reduce our electricity costs. Flock size adjustments. So we work with farms that increase their flock to get more birds through the same amount of overhead expenses. We worked with farms who identified that they had really high losses because they didn't have systems in place to manage that many birds. They reduced their flock size and actually increased their farm profitability. We had farms that just by making smarter mileage management decisions. So instead of going to the feed store twice a week, you get it delivered once a month. Even paying the delivery fee, you're saving money by not having to drive to the store that often. Better labor efficiency, improved marketing, and deciding to raise the price of their products. So, should you raise the price of your products? Probably, and I'm going to tell you why. We asked, as I mentioned, what the average price of a whole, we asked a lot of different questions about prices. What do you charge for whole bird? What do you charge for pieces? Do you charge differential prices for different markets? Due to our small sample size and that variability that we were talking about, it's really hard for us to confidently share data on those items. We are able to share that on average, $5 per pound for a whole bird was kind of like the average price, right? But just as a really good indicator of why the average isn't always the most helpful number, the range was $2.50 per pound of whole bird, all the way up to $11 per pound for a whole bird sale. So that range is really interesting because that means that you have farms that are making decisions all along that range. We get to the average of $5, right? But we have farms that are below that $5 and we have farms that are above that $5. I will tell you that farms in general, anecdotally, farms that were below $5, they were below average, were not as profitable as farms who were above average. And it might seem like really intuitive to be like, well, yeah, of course, farms that are charging more for their product were more profitable, but there's so much more behind it. There's considerations about marketing. There's considerations about raising your animals the way that fits your farm and being able to set your price accordingly and really chasing that break-even point so that you can set yourself up for success and high profit. So is raising broilers profitable? It depends, okay? It depends. What we found is farms probably feel profitable raising broilers. 69% of farms that participated on this project had a positive contribution to net farm income, so they were profitable, right? Their profit equals income minus expenses. They had a higher income than their expenses, so they had a profit. They were profitable. When it came to their total expenses without non-cash labor. So if you did not pay yourself, right, you were profitable. If you earned $0, you were profitable. You had a positive net farm income. When we added in the non-cash expense for labor, which, as I mentioned before, was only valued at minimum wage. And every single farmer that's out there is working at an above minimum wage level, right? You are working hard, you are using strategy, you are using thinking, you are wearing 16 different ball caps, you are managing a business. So it kills me to value your labor at minimum wage. Please know that. But when we added that non-cash expense of minimum wage value labor, only 26% of farms had a positive contribution to net farm income. And that positive contribution to net farm income was small. It was not anything that could support a household budget. It was not anything that could grow your farm. It just meant that you managed to break even and have a little bit to buy a pizza at the end of the day. Only 26% of the farms had a positive contribution to net farm income, were profitable. Oops, hold on one second. So now oh, you know what? I think I messed up my slides here a little bit. That's all right. We're going to spoil the surprise. So one of the questions that we got asked a lot on this project was, does it matter if I process my broilers on farm or off farm, right? And so it might be really easy to kind of negotiate that in your head of, oh, of course it was on farm. Of course it was off farm. What we found is there was a little bit of a profitability difference, but it really truly wasn't enough to set them apart. So some of the problems when it comes to profit, you feel like you're making money, right? You have cash to deposit. You have, I can't remember what it was, $1.26 per broiler to deposit into your checkbook. But once you put in your non-cash expenses of labor, you're really not making money anymore. So is raising broilers profitable? Probably not. And it's probably not if you're not managing it, if you're not valuing your labor, if you're not keeping an eye on your expenses, if you're not spreading these expenses across other areas of your farm. This was my drum roll to bring up the topic of on-farm processing or off-farm processing. So should you process on-farm or off-farm? And the answer is that it depends. We thought we would see a big difference. And you know, this is just a really good example of I shouldn't make guesses year one, right? So once the data started coming in, we thought we saw a difference where it was like, ooh, okay, we could talk about this, right? We could talk about this. And then the difference got a little bit less, but it was still not like truly significant, but it was still different. So we could talk about it. Now that we have all of the flock data in, the flock financial data in, there is no difference in costs between on-farm processing and off-farm processing. There is 1 penny's difference, which is not statistically significant. On average, it was $8.75 per broiler processed for farms to process on farm. This included their time, this included their equipment, this included their cash expenses like soap and bags. It was $8.76 per broiler processed for off-farm processing. That included mileage, time and delivery, and the fee paid to the processor. So it comes down to a balancing act. Asking yourself, do I want to value my time? Do I want to value my product? And which one of these best fits my farm goals? 26% of farms had a positive contribution to net farm income for their broiler enterprise with non-cash labor, right? So this is like the overall farms. 26% of farms overall, regardless of what type of processing they did, had a profit. Does the way that you process affect your profitability? Because it's not just as easy as saying this one costs more or this one, right? Because there's so many other nuanced things. And this is where we get into correlation versus causation. There's so many other nuanced things. If you're not processing, do you have time to market your animals better? If you're paying somebody else to process, do you have time to check in on your next batch of chicks earlier and catch coccidiosis earlier and treat them earlier? If you are processing your own birds, are you able to market them at a higher price as a value-added service? Are you processing them and reducing your mileage costs? And the answer is we did not have enough data to figure that out, but I'm giving you these numbers just to show you an example of what that range looks like. Our average farm, 26% of them were profitable, okay? When we looked specifically at farms that processed on farm, 32% of them were profitable. So slightly higher than average, right? Slightly higher than average. Statistically so, probably not given our sample size, but slightly higher than average farms were more likely to be profitable if they were processing on farm, versus 18%, only 18% of farms who were processing off farm were profitable. Again, this is an extremely small sample size, so it's not really easy to say, yes, like this is causation here. But I just wanted to show you that that difference is there. So should you process them yourself or send them out? I think it comes down to asking yourself, how do you want to spend your time? Does your market have a preference? Do your customers care? What's the availability for your area? Do you have the skills and knowledge to process them on your own? Do you have insurance? Right? These are all questions that you have to ask yourself when you're trying to decide how you should process your birds. And then lastly, should you raise conventional birds or slow growth birds? The answer is it depends. Unfortunately, we had such an extremely limited sample size when it came to our slow growth birds and our mixed flock birds. We didn't have enough farms to draw clear causations, right? We could only come up with a whole bunch of correlations. Track your money, record keeping. You can't manage what you can't measure. Keeping an eye on your overhead expenses, keeping an eye on your direct expenses, things that you can more easily control. You can't make any of those decisions unless you're actively tracking it. Keeping accurate records goes hand in hand. It sometimes can be a little bit scary to see how much money you're losing, but as soon as you see it, you are able to manage it. And 81% of the farms on our project were able to improve their profitability. And I think that a large part of that was just through going through the practice of keeping accurate records. And then one thing that we did find throughout this project is that farms that had, and again, this is a little bit of correlation, but farms that had lower chick costs or lower feed costs or lower input costs weren't necessarily more profitable, right? It might make sense. Whoever bought the cheapest chick is the most profitable because they had the least expense there, right? Or we're always trying to research, where can I find the cheapest chicks or the most expensive chicks or the best chicks? There really wasn't a great line of causation between chick costs, right? But that's one of the things that we think about all the time. Where it really pieced farms apart was when we talked about labor, when we talked about marketing, when we talked about what price are you selling your whole birds at. So these are my biggest takeaways. Again, I apologize for not being able to join you live, but please reach out if you have any questions or concerns. Thank you again to Amy for letting me do my presentation this way. Thank you to all of the farmers for your time spent on this project. I really appreciate it. So take care. Thank you.
Alrighty. So that was Caitlin's portion. We have been texting throughout the course of her presentation, and she is available to, hey, there she is, answer questions involved with anything pricing, profit, or paperwork related. So same thing, raise your hand if you want to ask verbally, and if you want to pop it in the chat or Q&A, you're welcome to do that too.
And if it's problem related, just save it for an email that I can check tomorrow.
So Megan asks, she's just wondering about a good profit margin for farm products. Is there a goal that you want to achieve?
Ooh, good question. The goal for a profit margin for farm products is what you need to sustain your household budget, right? So I think it's really interesting because if you think about like the grocery store world, there's different products. There's just like a standard, this is how much we mark up toothpaste. This is how much we mark up apples. For me, at least, in my very humble opinion, when I'm thinking about how do we direct market to customers, our customers are not the average person that's going to grocery stores that are just used to those habitual shopping activities and knowing how much a tube of toothpaste is going to cost. So when they're coming to our farm, they're looking for a value-added service. They're looking for an above average product. And so at that point, the sky's the limit. And obviously there is a limit, right? But I think it's up to you and your farm goals and your customer base to decide, is it quantity, right? So you have a smaller margin, you have a lot of customers coming through, you want to continue to be a hub where a lot of people are traveling, or is it a higher profit margin and you're offering an exceptionally like a specialty service, right? So the answer is it depends, you know?
Excellent. All right, so let's see. Jumping over to the hand raises again, we're gonna try technology again. All right, Mimi, you came in next. I'm asking you to unmute now.
Can you guys hear me?
There you go.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your time and all your research on this. It's been really interesting, and I love all the work that you guys did. I just have a quick question since I'm actually a statistics teacher, and Kaylin, I really appreciated how when you were talking about the mean price per pound of a meat chicken, you said the mean isn't um, a very good measure of the center
Right.
because of the high range. I was just wondering, did the data in those price per pounds that you found, was it skewed left or right, or what was the median price per pound? That might be a better data.
Yeah, I definitely we pulled those numbers. I don't say we. I chose to stick with averages because I feel like that's the most relatable for folks. So I don't have them with me right now, but we did pull medians for all of our data. We data set size wise, we did not have enough to do a lot of like best practices for statistics, right? So we were dealing with a lot of survey level data is kind of how I approached it. And so I tried to do my best to pull out averages and explain the story, but then look at it more from a anecdotally, like what would this mean for your farm level? So yes, we can get you the medians for a lot of those, like the larger data sets, and be able to take a look at those and share those with folks. We just chose to stuck with averages, knowing that that was kind of the most easy to understand and relate to.
Right, maybe next time you could throw the standard deviation in as well, just to give us.
Not this one. This one was.
Okay.
The thing is we had a lot of great data sets, but because of the variability, like it was really tough to try to pull cohesive numbers, right? And to be able to say like, yeah, here's our standard deviation. So we really were not reaching for the answers, but we had to kind of scale back the detailed level of the data that we hoped to get.
Thank you for everything. Great job.
Thanks, Mimi.
All right. So question just came in here. Hold on, I need to scroll up to see the whole thing. More of a comment. I feel that selling broilers helps us keep ag assessment, etc. I think finding new customers is difficult, but overall beneficial for the farm. Do you have suggestions on attracting customers outside of your immediate circles?
Yeah. I just wanted to like echo your comment about I think I mentioned this, that broilers on their own, it was tough for us to find a profitable circumstance that would work. But broilers is a part of a larger farm marketing plan, right? So it's like eggs. Amy and I always talk about how you're never gonna make money selling eggs, but you will get customers who come and buy beef from you, right? You will get customers who come regularly to buy some value added product. I look at chickens as an extension of it. So if managed correctly, if priced correctly, if you're keeping an eye on your expenses, you can be profitable. You're just not going to be profitable at the level that you can support your entire household on it, right? But it can contribute to whatever your goals are. So if it's ag value assessment, if it's quitting your day job, if it's just supporting the other efforts that you have on your farm. So for me, when I'm thinking about how do we attract new customers to the farm, knowing that we're trying to continue to grow our overall sales value for the farm, I like to think a lot about who's already coming and then what's the next step past them, right? So if I have moms who are coming to my farm stand because I'm offering bulk boxes at like an affordable price, I'm not going to go try to then also attract customers who are looking for a higher end, higher quality cuts of meat or parsed out and trimmed chicken breast, and try to get them to come to my farm as well, because it's tough for me to create marketing plans and efforts that are going to serve both customers. If my current primary customer was moms looking for bulk products at an affordable price, then the side step is more moms looking for bulk products at an affordable price, and then I might say, okay, well, who else would want bulk products at an affordable price? And how can I market to them? My joke that I always use for people is that the more specific you can get for your marketing, the more effective you're going to be. So I think all the time we're like, oh, we market to everybody because our product is for everybody. We want everybody to buy it. By marketing to everybody, you're effectively marketing to nobody, right? Because you're not truly connecting with anybody. So I guess, Kim, long story short, I think identifying who's already your customer and then brainstorming about who's next. after them, right? And how could you connect with them? And then the other thing too is for a lot of us smaller farmers, we have an endless supply of our current customers, right? We can keep getting more of our current customers because it's not like you're selling to every single customer in your customer base. So figuring out how to attract them and going through one of our outstanding marketing 101 workshops where we walk you through developing a marketing plan for your business and focusing on highlighting your products and what you're doing. Because you're doing some cool things, Kim.
Excellent. All right. So I'm going to give about 10 more seconds of thought time for you to put something into the chat or to raise your hand. And in the meantime, what I'll say is some housekeeping things, which are a recording of this whole presentation will be cleaned up and will be available to you. Will be sent to the email address that you registered with. And you're welcome to keep that for you, rewatch, share, whatever you'd like. Also look out for a survey in that email. It's going to tell us what we did well, what we could do better, what you learned from this, so that we can help promote other projects into the future and make those projects things that are what you want to know more about. So they're really, really helpful for us if you could get an opportunity.